I'd just like to comment that I had the opportunity to attend the Evidence Institute this year and found it really inspiring to see what a group of individuals, health professionals across a state who choose voluntarily to come together to share survivorship do's and don'ts can actually accomplish. So for our next speaker, yesterday there was a lot of discussion about the need for dissemination and implementation science to really be incorporated into survivorship care and research. So we're very fortunate enough to have David Chambers here from the National Cancer Institute in this session to discuss that.
Thanks, everyone. I'm assuming this is going to, yeah, the green button looks good. So just want to say, from what I gather, and you'll see in a couple of slides, a lot of the things that I'm going to say to you, you've been saying to each other, and I have the benefit of being able to repeat those things in hopes that the more we repeat them, the more it will come to pass. So that is my goal. What I wanted to do relatively quickly is just give you a sense of what are we thinking about when we look at the science of dissemination and implementation. A little bit about some of our models that have been developed over years, a little bit about opportunities, and then finish with a couple of resources that might help us move a little bit further. But the overall message is we absolutely need you, and the more folks we can get thinking about the interface between survivorship care delivery and dissemination and implementation research, the better, at least we believe, things will go down the line. So has anyone seen this picture before? Okay, so we got one, maybe a couple others. So what this tries to emphasize is how important it is not just to assume that the end product of our research is that magical publication, even though we have all sorts of incentives and all sorts of good things that we perceive are going to happen from that. What it shows is the pathway that we hope will happen as we get from the completion of our original research into that publication process of submitting, accepting, having it published, hopefully having it wind up in various databases where it moves into reviews, guideline development, textbooks, and then gets implemented. On the left side, you see all of the ways in which valuable findings, whether positive or negative, get lost as we move along toward implementation. And on the right side, this was an estimate that was done in 2000. It takes a while for each of these stages to happen. So if we assume we're going to get there by the publication, what we're likely to have happen in conclusion is that 17 years will pass before a fraction of that original research makes an impact on patient care. So again, people have probably been more familiar with this tagline, the 17 years, 14% thing, because it's been used. It was used in the State of the Union address a few years ago. But what it emphasizes is how science cannot end with that publication of those trial results or that initial epidemiological research. We need to do more than that. So I will now be the third person or fourth person just in this panel to re-emphasize something that everyone continues to emphasize. I'll tell you why I use this. I use it as a reminder that anything is possible. I grew up outside of Chicago as a Cubs fan. It took many of my lifetimes before the Cubs finally won the World Series. And so, but the reality is it's not going to happen on its own. No matter how beautiful this baseball diamond is, there are a whole range of reasons why people are not going to come, are not going to use it. And we need to think about those reasons as much as possible, as early as possible. Okay. There we go. So one of the reasons that this comes to pass is we've been very good in the scientific community about focusing on supply. We've been supplying ever more models of care, ever more interventions, without necessarily thinking about the demand side of it. So if you can't see the specific cartoon where you are, or the words that go along with it, it's someone who's peddling snow cones. You'll see an igloo. That's a clue to me that it's kind of a cold place to sell snow cones. And the person comes out and says, trust me, Harold, it's not or demand, it's supply and demand. It is amazing how little we focus on demand when we're thinking about all of the different health interventions that we're developing, that we're testing, and then again, we're going to assume are going to find that marketplace. We really need to be putting each of our models to the test to say, who is demanding this? And of course, we have different people that we have to think about in terms of demand. We have to think about our providers. We have to think about our administrators. We have to think about our payers. Most importantly, we need to think about our patients and our families at the center of this. And often, we're not doing a good job of that. So if we think about an evidence-based program, let's just assume we have this wonderful evidence-based program for survivorship care. It's really only going to be so good as whether it's adopted within different systems, that within those systems, providers are getting the training that they need to deliver it appropriately, but not just that, that trained providers are going back and figuring out a way to incorporate it into their practice. But more than that, that anyone who might benefit from that particular program that provider is seeing is going to get it. None of these things we can take for granted. In fact, if we did pretty well, and I'll tell you from our look at this kind of cascade, 50% is actually a pretty good job. If we got 50% of systems to adopt it and 50% of providers within those systems to be trained and then choose to deliver it, another half, and then we got to about half of the people, we're already down to 6% of the benefit that we thought was going to accrue when we published that wonderful trial result of that program. And that doesn't even get into what we know to be true challenges in terms of access, in terms of adherence, in terms of the dosage of particular programs, and in terms of maintenance or sustainability over time. This is a way of laying out. Are people familiar with REAIM? Okay, so a few folks maybe. So REAIM, Russ Glasgow, who was in my position at NCI before me, and colleagues had recognized that while we've made a lot of progress in moving from efficacy, sort of pristine efficacy trials, to effectiveness, even effectiveness is just one piece of the puzzle. We need to think about reach, how well we're reaching the population that we think is going to benefit from our program. And then we need to think about that important process of adoption, whether we can support organizations to deliver our interventions, whether they can be implemented effectively, and then whether they can be incorporated within systems over the longer term, maintenance, or what some people talk about, and the previous discussion about sustainability. So just to let you know, we recognize within this field there's a lot of different terms floating around, a lot of different definitions of those terms. And so at least for the purposes of the things that I'm going to say following, these are the terms that we use. My team at NCI is the implementation science team. And broadly, we're looking at activities where we can study methods to promote the integration of research findings, of evidence of health interventions into healthcare policy and practice. We define healthcare pretty broadly. It's basically anywhere where someone is getting care that could potentially impact their health, not just bricks and mortar health systems, but the broad sense of ways that people can have their needs met. We also use dissemination and implementation research. Dissemination research we see as the study of how information and intervention materials are distributed to different audiences. And so again, we have a lot of efforts, well-meaning, that don't do justice to getting that evidence to be taken up, to be understood, to be used by the variety of stakeholders who might benefit from it. And then we talk about implementation research, where we're really talking about that local, how do we get that practice change? How do we think what strategies are going to enable us to adopt and integrate different health interventions into the range of settings so that we can improve patient outcomes and that we can benefit the health of the population, not just one at a time. So when we look at studying implementation, we try and draw a contrast to what many of us are thinking about when we're looking at a particular intervention and the outcomes that we focus on. And so usually, if you look at the left, the what, we're thinking about what do we deliver to that individual patient? Quality improvements, empirically supported treatments. You could put evidence-based practices in this as well. On the right end is the other place that we're often looking. We're going directly to health outcomes, and this specific paper from 2009 talked about health status and symptoms, overall functioning, satisfaction. The usual trial that we support just looks at that left and that right. And by doing so, we jump over this really important question of how do we get that intervention to be taken up? And we jump over some really important outcomes in terms of, is it feasible for that intervention to be delivered? Is it acceptable to the population, to the systems that are supposed to be delivering it? How far through the system can it get to penetrate to all the providers who might be able to deliver it? Can it be sustainable? What level of uptake across different systems are we getting at? And what are the costs associated with implementation? And so again, this is the usual that we focus on, but with the implementation research, we're really trying to shift from that what to focus on that how. What are those implementation strategies that are going to get to higher rates of adoption of implementation and sustainability? Of course, implementation researchers are not going to be confident or comfortable if that's the extent, if they're able to move implementation outcomes. The key really is to have that cascade benefit on the health systems and community settings and on health outcomes at a population level. So there's a lot of D&I models that have been developed. We did a review a number of years ago where we identified 109 of them, 109 different frameworks trying to lay out what is the pathway from research into practice. By the end of it, when we were just specifically focusing on those used in the research area, we still found 61 models. Some of them more focused on the dissemination of information, others focused a little bit more on how do you implement health interventions. And so what we tried to do, they also, you'll see SEF, that's the socio-ecological framework, we tried to look at, were they focusing on change at the individual level, at the organizational level, at the broader system level? What I'd like to do is just give you a snapshot of a couple of these models because I think it recalls all of the wonderful presentations both yesterday and this morning. So Rogers' Diffusion of Innovations, has anyone heard of that one? Okay, yeah. So most folks have, right? So an oldie but a goodie, still one of the most frequently used in a lot of our NIH-funded research. Talks about how whether innovations get diffused into the broader marketplace, originally seed corn, but then into the health marketplace, is dependent upon the characteristics of the intervention. Does it have a comparative advantage over current practice? Is it simple or is it complex? It also focuses on, it's also important to understand the local organization, the characteristics that may make it easier or harder for that innovation to be delivered. And then importantly, there's this broader environment. There's the national policy context, there's the financing of care, et cetera. All of which Rogers posed multiple decades ago are important to understanding diffusion. And then also, recognizing that implementation is not akin to that light switch being flicked from off to on, but it's thinking about the decision to adopt. It's thinking about the support for effective implementation of that innovation, and then understanding outcomes at multiple levels, not just outcomes at the patient level, but going back to outcomes at the organizational and the broader environmental context. The second model that I'll just briefly go through, have folks heard about the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research? So this itself was an effort to try and synthesize a range of different models Laura Damschroder led the effort as part of the VA. And again, you'll see some of these same concepts, the inner setting, that local environment where the intervention is being delivered, the outer setting, the broader policy, funding, financing context, et cetera. What's really nice about this model and why I really like to use it is it recognizes that different interventions should be recognized for having core components and then potential areas where you can adapt. And even though it's not all that clear in this picture, what comes to mind when you look a little bit closer is the difference between the left and the right and the whole process to get you there. So the left shows an intervention which has not been adapted, which has not been customized, which has not been thought of in terms of the fit with the local setting. And as a result, it's like a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit. As you move through the implementation process and you think about the ongoing improvement that you would like to see happen, by the end, you're thinking about those meaningful adaptations that don't necessarily change those core components, those active ingredients, but allow for a better fit with the cultural context, with the organizational context, with the financing context of the local setting. And so as a result, it's a nice way to recognize that we might just want to move away from assuming the evidence-based practice in its manual is sort of, vacuum sealed, but really be thinking about adaptation over time, which again is something that we'd love to see more folks think about. So the opportunities are great, I will say. At least I hope you will join in these with us. And that's that at the NIH level, we've had these trans NIH announcements around dissemination and implementation research, the small grants, the larger grants, the exploratory developmental grants in between. NCI is the lead of this, but we have most of the institutes across NIH involved. And it is our way across all of health, because a lot of these issues extend beyond cancer, certainly, as was referenced also in the previous presentation. It's our way of organizing this research agenda across the agency. We've had more than 150 grants just funded through these mechanisms, through these funding announcements. And we have a standing review committee. People ask the question, well, yeah, I can come in, but what's the likelihood that expertise in dissemination and implementation research will be on the other end to review my application? Likelihood is high, because the Center for Scientific Review in 2010 pulled together a standing committee specifically focusing on dissemination and implementation research. So just to let you know, a couple of the areas that we would love to see some thinking, and particularly in the survivorship area, thinking more about local adaptation, ongoing improvement of evidence-based practices as they're being implemented, right? Something that Mary said right at the beginning of this session. Much more thinking not just about that initial implementation, but sustainability. Thinking about how do we take local programs and scale them up across health plans, across communities, across systems, across networks. And importantly, are there things that we are currently delivering in practice which we should not be doing? How can we focus on the de-implementation of ineffective or suboptimal care? For those who are interested, we've been trying to continue to build the capacity of investigators in this field. The first one has been an NCI-funded R25, a research education grant, mentored training, dissemination and implementation research in cancer, that WashU St. Louis, Ross Brownson is the PI of that one, has pulled together people, and a number of them focusing on survivorship, together into a 2-year training program to refine their ideas about dissemination and implementation research in cancer. The middle one is an annual training institute that we now do in concert with our annual meeting, which is both virtual sort of online modules as well as in person. And because we recognize that we can learn a lot across the globe, we've also been working with our Center for Global Health and other folks on international training in implementation science. Would love to see as many folks who are able to be in the DC area in December to come to our 10th annual now conference on the science of dissemination, implementation, and health. We did start it 10 years ago, and now this year is a chance for us to reflect on what has been learned over the last 10 years of active work in this field, but importantly, where are we going next? So whether you're focusing specifically on dissemination and implementation studies, in this particular graphic in that purple circle, or you're earlier in the continuum, I think we can all do a good job of trying to reflect both what we've learned, but also to learn more earlier about the ultimate aim, which is how do we implement optimal models to the benefit of populations. And so right here, you'll see that typical intervention development cycle, where you identify this clinically meaningful signal, you're developing an intervention, you're refining it, you're doing feasibility and pilot studies, you move to your efficacy, cleaner, more pristine studies, move more to effectiveness, and then hopefully to dissemination and implementation. I would argue that we really should be considering dissemination and implementation as early in the process as we possibly can. Can we be thinking as we're developing new models, who's actually in a position to deliver it within our systems, within our communities? What's the fit not just with the population that we want to enroll in our more pristine studies, but what's the fit with the ultimate patient population that we think should benefit from this particular intervention? Are there ways, as we're testing these models, that we can build in some of the tests of the key factors that are going to be important as we move to implementation? Can we better understand how to train providers? What are different models that will support a higher return on our investment of training? What are the better ways that we can support different providers? And we heard from a couple of the wonderful community local models of the need to think about these different provider teams. How do the teams get supported? How can we think about adherence not just to treatment, but potentially to different core components of models that we see to be helpful for survivorship outcomes? And then how can we understand what are some of the things that are going to impact our ability to deliver our models with as high quality as possible? The hybrid designs, again, from the VA have been a nice opportunity to say, let's not wait until after we have an effective intervention, but let's try and build implementation research into our effectiveness research. It ranges from hybrid type 1s, where you're basically doing an effectiveness trial while capturing information about implementation within the settings where you're doing the trial, and then moves into type 2 and type 3, where you're focusing more on what can we learn about the strategy that we're using within our clinical or our community settings to implement the intervention for the purpose of the trial, and how can we capture some of those key implementation outcomes so that at the end of the day, we don't just know that these models are effective, but we know a little bit about how to implement them across different communities and systems. We also have a program at NCI that we've been piloting over the last year or so called SPRINT, Speeding Research-Tested Interventions. The idea here is that many folks who are developing interventions aren't necessarily thinking about that broader marketplace or what happens after my trial is completed. Again, the incentives are often around the publication, not around implementation. So we have a training model that's been based on the National Science Foundation I-Corps model, where you're basically working with investigative teams as they're doing their trial to be thinking about that broader marketplace, to really understand what's the fit between those who at least I hypothesize are going to be in a position to use my intervention or receive my intervention and the intervention in the way it's designed. And the first couple of cohorts that have gone through have identified that there's some key mismatches between the hypotheses that they had about why their intervention would be used or not used and what ultimately resulted. So just want to reflect, this is all available on our website. Multiple projects that are related to cancer survivorship care, but not enough. We do have a few folks who are thinking about survivorship and implementation, but it would be wonderful, and I would guess that Julia would agree with me, it would be wonderful to see more people moving into the space. We also, within our research-tested intervention programs, sort of repository of evidence-based practices, have a whole range of programs in a relatively new category of survivorship and supportive care. So you'll see 17 programs there listed. It would be wonderful to have more. It would be also wonderful to think about how these existing programs fit or could be adapted into the range of different community settings. So lots of work to do. I would love to talk to anyone and everyone about ways that we can move this forward together. And I just want to say thank you.